Hey guys, welcome back to another video in my healing series. Today we'll be looking at the Holy Paladin in Shadowlands. We'll look at some of the bigger changes the spec has had and how those changes will affect the way we heal. As always, I'll start with a basic overview. The Holy Paladin's strengths are that it is a strong, single target healer with a ton of utility to offer their group. Both their mastery, which increases your healing the closer you are to your targets, and their damage abilities want them to be in melee range right in the thick of the action. The weaknesses of the Holy Paladin, there's a couple. A lack of any consistent AoE healing, pretty garbage mobility, and an over-reliance on stats like haste to make the spec feel good. This would also be a good place to talk about some of the important changes we've seen. Number one being that Holy Power is back. We have some spells that generate holy power and some that spend it. We'll cover more on this when we get to rotations. Next to mention is auras being baseline for all paladins. The Holy Paladin used to have an entire talent row for these auras, and they're now part of our baseline toolkit, so I'm going to briefly cover them here. Crusada aura we'll never take. This increases mount speed by 20% for all party and raid members within 40 yards. Unless there's a very specific outdoor raid mechanic that requires it, we would never take it. Maybe if you're out playing solo. Retribution aura will give you the Avenging Wrath buff for 12 seconds anytime a party or raid member dies. Again, we're never going to take that. Concentration aura, which we get at level 52. Will reduce interrupt and silence durations on all party and raid members by 30%. We might consider this if there's a raid fight, obviously, that has a lot of long, annoying silence effects, but outside of that, Devotion Aura is what we will almost always take, and this just provides a passive 3% damage reduction for all party and raid members within 40 yards. And now with that basic overview out of the way, let's jump right into our healing rotation. Beacon of Light is a baseline spell we have. This will copy 50% of all of our healing done to other allies onto our Beacon of Light target. So we want to always keep Beacon of Light up on our tank, since we then end up passively healing the tank every time we heal someone else in our party. Another small change that we saw that I'm just going to briefly mention is that Beacon of Light no longer provides us with the passive mana refund we saw in BFA, so just keep that in mind, it will come up later. Next up is Holy Shock. This is our main bread and butter healing ability. This is an instant cast heal with a cooldown that's dependent on haste. The baseline cooldown of this spell was recently buffed to 7.5 seconds from the formerly absurd 9 seconds, but again, you do want as much haste as possible, so you have this up very frequently. So Holy Shock will deal damage if you target an enemy with it, or it will deal a very decent amount of healing if you target an ally with it. It also generates us 1 holy power, so we want to use this ability off cooldown. Next up is Light of Dawn. This is arguably our second bread and butter ability. This is also our only AoE heal. You'll notice that this does not generate us holy power, but instead costs 3 holy power. It's worth noting that this is a positional ability, meaning we'll want to make sure we're actually facing our party members to ensure we're healing them. Word of Glory is a new ability we have for Shadowlands. This is a large, single target instant cast heal that costs 3 holy power. Next up to talk about is Light of the Martyr. This is an interesting ability because it has both upsides and downsides. The upsides are that it's instant cast, it has no cooldown, it heals for a moderate amount, and it's fairly cheap. The downside is that we take damage for 50% of the amount healed. It also does not benefit our Beacon of Light passive healing, and it also cannot be used on ourselves. So, we really only want to use this if a member of our group took an incredible amount of damage and needs to be healed instantly, and we don't have enough holy power to use Word of Glory. Moving on. Flash of Light and Holy Light are our filler spells, which we really only use when our bread and butter abilities are on cooldown. Flash of Light is a smaller heal that costs a little more mana because it has a faster cast time. And Holy Light is a larger heal that costs a little less mana because it has a longer cast time. I won't spend much time on these since, as I said, they're simply filler abilities. Our core rotation then would be this. Keep Beacon of Light on your tank all the time. Spot heal individual group members with Holy Shock off cooldown for Holy Power generation. Once you have 3 Holy Power built up, use that Holy Power either on Light of Dawn for a quick AoE heal, or on Word of Glory for a large single target heal. And that's our basic healing rotation in a nutshell. Now let's briefly talk about our core damage abilities. Consecration is something we'll want to have down every time we're in combat since it provides just some passive AoE damage and costs nothing. Judgment is our highest single target damage ability, and we'll want to weave this in off cooldown for added damage. Next up, Crusader Strike. We definitely need to talk about this. It has seen 2 key changes. First, it now generates us 1 Holy Power, which is great. Second, it also now costs a crap ton of mana to use, which is not so freaking great. This is, in my opinion, one of the key culprits in our rotation not feeling as smooth as it might have otherwise. Next up, there are 2 new damage abilities that are worth talking about, coming for all Paladins in Shadowlands, the first of which is Hammer of Wrath. This will generate us 1 Holy Power, and it does great damage, but can only be used on targets who are below 20% health, or on any target during Avenging Wrath. The second new ability we have is Shield of the Righteous. Again, all of these are baseline for all Paladins. This will do moderate AoE damage to enemies in front of us, and provide us with a decent amount of armor for 4.5 seconds, but it costs 3 Holy Power, so we should only use this when our party is healthy and stable, and we would otherwise overcap our Holy Power. And that wraps up our baseline rotation. So let's start working our way through the Holy Paladin's obscene amount of cooldowns. We'll start with our group cooldowns in our Blessings, which again are baseline for all Paladins. So, Blessing of Protection. This is a physical damage immunity. Just immunity, nothing at all, no damage. We can provide this to an ally and it will protect them for 10 seconds. It has a 5-minute cooldown and will also give the ally we used it on a debuff called Forbearance, which lasts for 30 seconds and just simply will prevent us from using another ability like Blessing of Protection during that 30-second window. Next up is Blessing of Sacrifice. This will reduce a party or raid member's damage taken by 30% for 12 seconds. While this effect is active, we take 75% of the damage that we prevented that ally from taking. This effect will automatically cancel if we would have fallen below 20% health from the damage transfer, so don't worry about using it like too much, don't be paranoid about it. You do want to use this to prevent, your party member from taking a large chunk of damage. This is also our only external DR to give to our tank. So it has a fairly short 2-minute cooldown, and it also does not cause that Forbearance debuff, so feel free to let the good times roll. Next up is Blessing of Freedom. This will grant ourselves or a party member immunity to movement impairing effects for 8 seconds on a short 25-second cooldown. This has fairly niche but powerful nonetheless uses in raids and Mythic Plus encounters, but it is mostly used in PvP. Finally, for our large cooldowns, we have Lay on Hands. Also, again, baseline for all Paladins. This will heal ourselves or an ally for however much our max HP is. This is an incredibly large heal that will take most allies from the brink of death to full HP instantly. Because of that, it has a very long 10-minute cooldown and will also cause that Forbearance debuff on the ally we used it on. This is your ultimate oh shit button, so use it wisely. For utility cooldowns, we have Hammer of Justice, which is our baseline single target stun on a 1-minute cooldown, and then we have Cleanse, which is our baseline dispel effect. This will remove all poison, disease, and magic effects from ourselves or an ally every 8 seconds. We do, of course, want to have this keybind and be using it regularly to dispel people. Finally, let's move on to our personal cooldowns, starting with our defensive CDs. Divine Protection is our shorter cooldown defensive. This will reduce all damage we take by 20% for 8 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown. And then Divine Shield is our larger defensive, which will grant us immunity to all damage and harmful effects for 8 seconds on a 5-minute cooldown. This is essentially a blessing of protection just for ourselves, and thus we will also get that forbearance debuff when we use this. Next up is our healing CDs. Aura Mastery will empower our chosen aura, which in our case of course would be Devotion Aura. It will empower it for 8 seconds on a 3-minute cooldown. This will make Devotion Aura's passive damage reduction go from 3% all the way up to 15%. So this cooldown should be used to help mitigate incoming AoE damage from a scary raid or Mythic Plus mechanic. Finally, for healing cooldowns, we have Avenging Wrath. Every 2 minutes, we increase our damage, healing, and crit chance by 30% for 25 seconds. This is a very powerful healing cooldown and will also allow for some substantial damage output as well if we're weaving in our damage abilities properly. So with our mini cooldowns covered, we are now finished with our baseline toolkit and we can move right into our talents. Starting with row 15 then. Crusader's Might is a solid option in both raids and Mythic Plus if you have lower haste values or you're just not as concerned with mana usage, since you will basically be spamming Crusader Strike to reduce the cooldown on your Holy Shock by 1.5 seconds. Next up is Bestow Faith in this same row. This is also a strong contender for Mythic Plus content, and this is the one I've been playing around with. I like it a lot. It grants additional tank healing, additional holy power generation, and doesn't have the downside of costing a crap ton of mana. With the changes to like mana regeneration, I'm sure you guys have heard, the drinks that you have during like Mythic Plus now just take forever. It's really awkward, so it's just something to keep in mind, you guys, when you're putting together these like healing builds, is that you can no longer have the same sort of drinks between pulls that we used to that just take a little longer. Next up, for level 30, we'll almost always take Blinding Light. This will act as an AoE interrupt for a dangerous pack of casters, or a standard disorient if your tank needs to kite. Since we don't have a baseline interrupt ability, this is just universally helpful. For solo play or arenas, I would recommend Fist of Justice instead to have your stun off cooldown more frequently. Next up, our row 35 talents all have good uses in different situations. You would take Rule of Law in raids to provide strong throughput healing on more spread out fights every 30 seconds. Again, this goes back to our mastery. And then for solo content or non-dangerous Mythic Plus content, you would take Cavalier so that you have some added much needed mobility. For more dangerous fights or dungeons where you're worried about being one-shot, you can take Unbreakable Spirit, and this will provide a cooldown reduction to your defensives. Now, on to the interesting stuff. For row 40, we will always take Holy Avenger if we're doing any kind of content that requires some big burst healing or damage, since we'll be able to spam out our Word of Glory and our Light of Dawn, or we can instead choose to use that increased holy power generation for more damage. We would take Divine Purpose on this row instead for more casual types of content where the longer CD burst windows aren't required. Moving on to our level 45 talents, Sanctified Wrath will be our go-to. This causes our Avenging Wrath to last 25% longer and reduces Holy Shock's cooldown by 40% while Avenging Wrath is active. This is particularly powerful with our Glimmer of Light build, which is precisely the talent we're taking in our final row. So Glimmer of Light, the talent, is especially great right now during the pre-patch, since this talent is stacking with our Glimmer of Light Azurite traits that we have. So Glimmer of Light causes our Holy Shock to leave a Glimmer of Light on our Holy Shock target. It's basically just a buff. So every time we use Holy Shock, after this buff is applied, all targets that have the Glimmer of Light effect on them will be healed for a small amount, and we can have this Glimmer of Light effect active on up to 8 targets. This becomes increasingly more powerful as you have more haste and thus have Holy Shock off cooldown more often, allowing you to keep up an almost constant flow of passive Glimmer of Light healing. It's nutty. Nothing else in this final row comes close to competing with this talent for right now. And that will wrap up our talents. Our final talking point is going to be about legendary effects coming in Shadowlands and which are the strongest for us. So, while we technically have 8 different legendary effects to choose from, only 3 are strong enough to be in contention. Starting off, From Dusk Till Dawn is a neutral legendary effect and is the weakest of the 3 I mentioned. Every time we have 5 holy power, we gain a buff called Blessing of Dawn. This will increase our damage and healing by 5% for 8 seconds. Then, alternatively, every time we have no holy power, we gain the Blessing of Dusk buff. This will reduce our damage taken by 3% for 8 seconds. I considered this legendary only because it provides a controllable, albeit small, flexible buff depending on the situation we're in. However, like I said, this is the weakest of the 3, so let's move on to the other 2. Shadowbreaker, Dawn of the Sun. I'm excited about this one. This will give a substantial buff to our Light of Dawn healing range, and also increases all the healing we do to the allies that we hit with Light of Dawn by 20% for 6 seconds. We can realistically have this healing buff up very often, which makes this powerful for any kind of content that requires a lot of AoE healing, like Mythic Plus dungeons. Finally then, Shock Barrier will cause our Holy Shock heals to give the target an absorption shield for 18 seconds. This shield absorbs a moderate amount of damage every 6 seconds, and we can have this effect active on up to 3 targets. I expect this to scale reasonably well since the absorption amount is based on our spell power. And frankly, we use Holy Shock so much more than any of our other spells that unless the damage absorption Shock Barrier provides is negligible, we would likely still want this legendary at our disposal. Pairing this with the Glimmer of Light build would mean that we would have 3 party members constantly coated in passive healing and damage absorption, which just seems super strong. And with our legendaries now covered, that brings us to the end of this guide for the Holy Paladin and Shadowlands. Leave me a comment below letting me know which legendary you find most interesting, and drop me a like and a sub if you like my content. As always, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!